And against? Carried. Thank you. So the next item is the time of use charging, and so while Mark, Hamish, Graham and Michael wander on up, just a reminder that this has been through a workshop, that has been through a political steering group, and this is about our submission to the amendment bill. It is not about what is best or what is coming. We don't even know. It's our submission, and hopefully we can get through it reasonably quickly, bearing in mind of what we have to come later. So, gentlemen, all yours.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, councillors. Chair, and I think you just read my introductory notes. This is a request to approve and submission to the bill. It is a draft submission, it is a draft time of use in charging legislation, and that is the purpose of the meeting today, not to necessarily agree to progress a scheme or to agree to progress the design of a scheme at this point. It is, in our view, obviously very important that we do respond to the bill and present opportunities for improvement, which is what's before you. I should just introduce the team. I'm sure you know everybody. Graham Gunthorpe is our Programme Director, Hamish Bunn from our policy team, and Michael Roth, you know, from Council. The work that you have seen and we're presenting today is a joint piece of work between Council and Transport, and it's a submission on behalf of the Council group. Our recommendation is that we believe we should be supporting the bill and the intent of the bill, but it should be subject to the resolution of the governance and revenue issues that we have identified in our submission. I'll just quickly cover a couple of context slides before I hand over to Hamish to briefly go through the recommendations. But in terms of context, why we're here now and what decisions have been taken previously. Going back to 2021, we thought we'd put a bit of a milestone in here. The previous council had supported time of use charging in principle, and that was through a submission to a select committee at the time on the previous Ministry of Transport research work, which was called the congestion question. And that is the starting point and the basis of all the work that we've been doing since then. In November 2023, the forerunner to this committee agreed to form a working group between Council and Transport and to effectively progress time of use charging as quickly as possible. And in June 2024, we agreed the programme objectives and next steps. The work to date, I'd like to emphasise, has been overseen by a political reference group, and that's what we're presenting today. Final slide from me, and just a bit of a reminder and further context is that the programme has also completed, and it was published a couple of weeks ago, a cost of congestion report into Auckland, which was led by Ernst & Young and Arup. It estimated that Aucklanders spend up to 29 million hours per annum stuck in traffic, and that equates on average broadly to 66 hours per annum of time delay. That equates to a $1.9 billion lost time opportunity for Aucklanders stuck in that congestion, which is also compounded by around $700 million of further impact on the economy per annum. It's also compounded by 120 million in additional vehicle costs by the additional travel time required, and $9 million in greenhouse gas emissions, which otherwise could be avoided. So in the interest of time, that's a bit of a context and background. I'll hand over to Hamish to go through our recommendations.
Thank you. Before I jump into that, I just wanted to also recognise the work done by Chris Gulick, who's my team leader. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but has played a key role in this. So before we jump into the specific recommendations, I thought we'd recap some of the background. Over the last 2024 in particular, we were tasked by this committee to undertake background work in preparation for this submission. We have done significant work. We've gone back over the international lessons learned from the schemes that have succeeded and haven't succeeded, or haven't been implemented, I should say. And we've also done some modelling of potential options, and that is very much drawn on in our submission. A couple of key points, you know, The implementation of these schemes is not guaranteed. They're difficult things to implement, but the ones that have been implemented, they've all succeeded, and they're all simple, fair, effective, and feasible. So those are the sort of our touchstones and thinking about the way we're doing it, and it's a test that we've also applied to this legislation. Will this legislation support simple, fair, effective, and feasible? We know that if we're going to put these schemes in place, they're going to impact across networks, they're going to impact across local roads, motorways, public transport networks. So that means we need to think about these things in an integrated way. It needs to be thought about jointly, and so we need to govern these schemes jointly. And the successful schemes are often led by a local champion. So we're really saying that local councils, local authorities need to be able to buy in, and they need to be able to have confidence that when they start this process, they're going to be able to shape the outcome. And again, that has really impacted the way that we've thought about this submission, and I'll come back to those points. We've also taken account, we've done extensive engagement, and we've taken account of that feedback that we've had from partners, stakeholders, and members in the community. You know, people see congestion as a problem. They're open to these schemes if they think that, you know, it's going to be a reasonable scheme that will succeed. But they are also fundamentally saying you need to have public transport alternatives. So those are some of the things that have really shaped our thinking as we've tackled the legislation. So just in terms of recap, the legislation that we're talking about here is the Land Transport Time of Use Charging Amendment Bill. It was released in December, introduced into, first reading in Parliament was March 2025, and the submission deadline is the end of this month. In terms of the way the legislation works, it enables time of use charging on existing roads. It sets out a governance structure, which in simple terms is that schemes can either be proposed by local authorities or the NZTA, and once a scheme proposal has occurred, initiation has occurred, then a scheme board is set up between NZTA and the relevant local authorities. That makes a submission to the Minister of Transport, and then he can approve that, and then it goes through to Order in Council. So that's the kind of governance process. There's also a range of other elements of the legislation which we'll touch on in terms of the key components of the submission. So at a high level, Mark's already really covered the essence of that we support the introduction of the bill, and we support the bill's purpose, which is a focus on congestion reduction. The bill has a generally enabling approach in terms of most of the elements of scheme design, so we support that kind of flexibility. And we also note that it requires impact assessments which include the views of Māori, so we support that element because we've had feedback from Hukura that they think that this is extremely... And the way that the draft bill is set up is it tends to be fairly centralising of decision making with the New Zealand Transport Agency and the Ministry of Transport. And we don't see that local authorities really have the kind of decision making rights over scheme development, particularly where they could impact on local networks or they could have direct cost implications for local authorities. So we recommend opposing the governance structure that is proposed in the bill, and we also recommend opposing another element, which is the use of scheme revenue for parts of the region not impacted by the charge, but I'll come to that. So in terms of some of the recommended improvements, I mean, these are all detailed in the submission itself, but the high level components are really that we propose the significant governance changes, and this is probably really the key thing here, that we'd like to see that the legislation changed to give local authorities that are impacted by the scheme a role in endorsing any scheme proposals or other significant changes before it goes to the Minister for approval. So just repeating that would bring local authorities, giving them a formal decision-making role on scheme design, on changes to the scheme, before it then goes to the Minister to approval. So it really makes sure that there's an opportunity for local authorities to shape and inform the scheme and represent the views of the community. We're also looking for joint decision-making in the scheme board, and consideration of the role of the Regional Transport Committee, that's going to change through the CCO change legislation, that's taken into account in the decision making. We're also recommending some improvements to revenue. At the moment, the legislation does not specifically include the use of revenue to fund things like additional public transport services or most local authority costs that might be associated with the scheme. So we're recommending that the legislation is amended to explicitly say that the revenue can and should be used for those matters, and that any remaining surplus after key scheme costs have basically been targeted, that any remaining surplus is targeted towards projects or services that will help those impacted by the schemes. In terms of mitigations, the current bill only allows for mitigations for emergency vehicles. However, we note that pretty much every other scheme that's in existence around the world has further mitigations, for example, for disabled users and such. So we are looking for greater flexibility within the legislation to enable mitigation. So the key wording there, firstly, reflecting the views of this council that government first used welfare tools at their disposal to mitigate impacts on vulnerable communities. But where that is not possible, we're saying that the legislation should enable limited mitigations, such as fare caps or exemptions, to address any really significant impacts on vulnerable groups, but where this does not materially impact the viability of the scheme, because we recognise that you don't want to open the door too far and end up with the scheme not doing what it needs to do. We're also seeking that scheduled public transport services should be exempt from the time of use charge. And then finally, there's some wrap-up elements around timing, trials and regulations. The bill's currently proposing a 1-year delay before implementation. We are saying that we think we ought to be able to go faster, particularly in an Auckland context. And we're also recommending, we're recommending the removal of that delay. We'd like to see some provision for trials. That's a key point that's been emphasised by the political reference group. And it could well enable the schemes to test different pricing levels as they're implemented, and that's a key factor. And there's a number of regulation powers that sit with the minister in the way that the legislation is framed here. We're kind of asking the question, well, why do we need those regulation powers? And if you do want to have them, we'd like to see consultation with local authorities before they're impacted. So that, I think, is a very, very quick run through of the key recommendations in the summary, in the submission, in the draft submission. The key next steps is that we'll take feedback, of course, from this committee on any changes to the bill. We need to do some tidy-ups to incorporate comments that we've had, an additional round of comments from Hakura, and take into account local board submissions as well. And then we need to submit this thing by the end of the month. And then in May, we're doing presentations to the Select Committee. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Someone like to move? Thanks.
Happy to move.
Thanks, Chris. And Chris Jr., thank you. Christine Fletcher, your question, please.
While we support the intent of the bill, I just want to come, Hamish and Mark, thank you for the introductory comments. You've had quite a bit of time to talk to your counterparts in Wellington. Was it just an omission, do you think, that they didn't make provision for any trialling? Because trialling, when you look at international examples, is quite important with this. That was one question. And the second question I have, was it their specific intention that revenue allocation would you know, we're making submissions to remedy that. But what was their rationale by not having the revenue allocation going into the areas where those who were receiving the financial charge? I'm just a little confused. You've done such a fabulous job as we've gone through the working party, and I'm very grateful for all of the insight we had. But I couldn't quite understand what the rationale was by the government introducing it in that form. So just on those two specific questions, if you could answer, please.
I think if I try and answer those questions first, there's been very limited conversation in the drafting of the bill with our counterparts in Wellington. It has been quite difficult to engage, to be honest, hence the amount of focus we put onto our submissions. With regards to trials, that's come from our lessons learned, as you've pointed out. And with regards to mitigations, the only possible insight we can probably give is that the view that it needs to be as simple as possible and as uncomplicated as possible. Hamish, don't know whether you want to add.
Yeah, on the point about revenue, I think to be fair to the legislation, there is provision in there for allocation of any surplus revenue towards additional costs. And perhaps that is where they thought that costs related to local authority costs or public transport services costs could be negotiated. But the point is that is in a negotiated agreement between the local authorities and the minister. What we are saying, to make sure it's not overlooked and to give local authorities and public transport authorities confidence, and the public confidence, that the public transport services are going to be funded, let's have it explicitly called out as one of the elements that should be funded within the key explicit part of the bill.
Thank you for that. Chair, I won't need to speak later because I'm realising that we're running a bit, but just in principle, we do need to support this legislation. It's been hanging around for many years. I do see it as a necessary evil if we're going to optimise the assets that we have, and I don't doubt that there will be quite a lot of pushback from the community on it. But I think our officers have done an excellent job in preparing the paper that's come to us, and I hope that it can enjoy the support of this committee.
Okay, Chris.
Thank you. Good to see this progress. Just in terms of the essential complementary measures, we identified public transport. In our workshop, I discussed the importance of public transport and active being referred to together, because we know when we talk public transport and the provision of public transport doesn't sing, doesn't work unless you get those active connections. You know, at Auckland Transport, we often talk about that in a holistic way, in a systems way. I guess just in terms of how I'm reading it here, we don't, and maybe I've missed something, so please correct me. Are we talking about the essential complementary measures as accessible public transport and also active transport? And I add the word accessible because I'm really concerned about the provision of public transport that then is not accessible because of fare structures which are starting to get away on us. So just a small thing there that you might like to, or it could be it's actually a large thing for you to address there. That's my first. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think conceptually that's what we're aiming for, that we are saying that all the essential elements really to make sure that the scheme works should be included and funded out of scheme revenue. So, yeah, and I think we would assume that public transport needs to be accessible, so we'll just look at the wording within that.
So the other part to that about it being PT and active being identified as essential. It's not just essentially provided for out of the revenue of the scheme. We've actually got to lift the bar at day one opening, because I thought that's how we were approaching it, that this support was conditional upon having in place the essential public and active transport system that Aucklanders need so they can divert to that. How are we articulating that? And are we clearly stating our considered support for time of use charging is conditional on having a robust and accessible public transport system that people can choose on day one, not just out of the essential measures, contributions?
I think that's a very good question, councillor, and it's an important part of gaining community support to implement a scheme, and that's why council has been, support has been conditional on that. This legislation cannot solve everything. This is just legislation to enable the scheme. So our focus in the submission has been to ensure that a proper public transport system is a component of it, and that the legislation itself makes sure that any surplus revenue gets directed towards the local area that's impacted, and in particular better public transport in that area to help gain that support. But of course you're correct, when we're later hopefully putting forward an actual scheme to operate, that should include considerations for improving public transport, either at the start of the scheme or just prior to implementation. But that doesn't necessarily have to be part of this legislation. That's about a particular scheme. We've focused on making sure that the revenue of this, of any scheme would go towards those improvements that we want.
So, and just to clarify then, so we would be advocating, we'd be working with government if it showed an appetite through legislation that eventually landed as an act and it enables us to do it. We would still be saying at that point, okay, you've given us the powers to implement it, or you might implement it for us through NZTA, but we would be saying then we need to show Auckland that there is or are very clear alternatives for movement across Auckland. So we would be working separately outside of our submission process to get the Auckland public transport and active network up to scratch so that there was a very clear and viable choice for Aucklanders to move on.
Well, I think absolutely that's all the work that Auckland Transport is doing, and Auckland Council has been funding. We're doing everything within the means that we currently can to have the best public transport system we possibly can anyway. And then I think what we're saying is if you're going to introduce time of use charging on top of that, then there will be instances where you can see that you would need specific additional public transport services and capacity to make the scheme work, to make sure that you've got a really great alternative, to make sure that existing public transport routes aren't overcrowded, and you'd be doing that as part of the scheme development. And that's why we're saying, hey, we want the scheme board to be, in terms of the governance, to be a really joint process that we engage in with NZTA and, and others. And then we want council to be able to have the ability to endorse the proposals to make sure that council is comfortable that the scheme is addressing all of these concerns. And we would like those additional public transport services to be funded out of scheme revenue without having to argue about it. So that's kind of where we're driving towards in the submission.
Yeah, look, that's good. I appreciate those answers. They're comprehensive, and I'll leave the point of, active being coupled with PT. Alf?
Please excuse me for this question. Could we find ourselves, I'm looking at implementation now, could we find ourselves that the main arterial routes that the government have deputation over different times to what we would have in our roads or roads that have come off the main arterial route? I mean, in my head I'm saying, well, yes, depending on the congestion, but then I just don't want us to sort of have congestion on our roads from 7 to 8 a.m. and then when they get onto the motorway, it's 10 to 11 or so. Look, yeah.
I mean, that could potentially happen, but what we're trying to drive towards again in the submission is that we want to say that we would want to work jointly with NZTA in scheme development, and even where the NZTA might propose a scheme, we still want NZTA's proposal to be subject to council endorsement before they go forward for approval, to make sure that, you know, if there are any differences, for example, in the times at which charging occurs or things like that, that they're ironed out and everybody is comfortable that they make sense and they're going to work for the user. So conceptually that might happen, but I think we would be trying to work to not happen, because you want simplicity for the user. So you want consistent times. That's one of the big principles. So we're saying in this submission, hey, we would like joint governance, we would like council endorsement. That way we can make sure that everybody's happy with the scheme and it's going to work for the customer.
So supplementary chair, so the backstop would be talking. Basically what you're saying, hey, that's the backstop, is bloody hopefully we'll talk and come to some resolution, because, yeah.
Well, I think that the front stop is talking, because we will always be talking with our colleagues in NZTA. The backstop is governance. But talking is better when it's backed up by governance.
I think I'd just add to that, Councillor, that the reason we are absolutely supporting this submission the way it's written is that there is a risk under the current legislation, significant risk, that there is no joint decision making, and therefore what you described could happen in theory. And with the changes we're proposing, it would be a joint governance, joint decision making, and therefore we would be able to actually manage the co-design properly.
Thank you. Shane?
Yeah, thanks. Just two quickies. So can I be crystal clear? The government can impose a scheme on Aucklanders even if we opposed it. So our first goal should be to work with it rather than against it? Cool. Okay. That makes things a little easier for me as a skeptic. Second and final question. Did you look at ring fencing revenue collected to be spent back in the area that we're paying for the scheme?
Yeah, that's one of our recommendations, that any surplus revenue after you've paid for all the essential elements of the scheme and all the additional public transport services and other, you know, things like active modes and traffic calming and so on and so forth. If there's a surplus, what we're recommending here is that should go towards the people in areas impacted by the scheme. At the moment, the legislation is saying that you can negotiate to see where it goes within the region. We're saying it needs to be tighter.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Joe?
Thank you. I support the submission. I think it's really good, especially in regards to the governance issues you raised, considering the bill only says for us as a local authority, we can enable our local authority to identify areas. We can propose indicative schemes. We can outline potential charging zones, but we don't actually have decision-making power. So, yeah, really appreciate the submission, and also picking up on the mitigation for our vulnerable communities. I think my question's been answered in regards to, well, they could go ahead and do this anyway, right? So, yep, cool. And then I did have a question about something that Bill mentions in regards to impact assessments and public engagement will support equitable implementation, and whether there was any more that could be fleshed out around that statement, like what does it look like, how, or is that more a question for the government?
The bill does set out provisions about what impacts need to be assessed and taken into account and reported on in making a scheme proposal. So I forget all of them, But it is things like impact on Māori, I think impact on vulnerable users, what are the costs and benefits to the various users, things along those lines. So the bill does have those provisions. But one of the observations that we make is that, you know, once you've identified these issues within the legislation, there's no opportunity to use mitigations or exemptions to address a lot of these issues. So it's one of the things that we're saying is one of the issues with the bill is it's great, it's very important that we understand what the implications are for everybody, but we also need a bit more flexibility to be able to address them as part of scheme design.
Yeah, I would support that response, especially when the theme I'm getting from it is, well, if there are vulnerable users, they could go to WINS, but the vulnerable users I'm talking about are actually workers in low-income households, not necessarily community service card holders. So, yeah, that's why I raised that. Okay.
Can I just supplemental? I think the extent to which impact assessments go, we've heard from business associations who really want to see local economic impact. For example, we've heard local board members want local board impact assessments. By making sure that council has representation on the governance, you can help set what the parameters are, what is the expectation of the joint program team to undertake those impact assessments.
Awesome, thank you.
Honey?
Now, kia ora. I've got 3 questions. And I'm aware we, as Haukura, have a representative on the political working group, similar to what Christine was making a reference to. So, in developing the draft submission, really simple, why wasn't the draft just submitted to Haukura, the Secretariat, just to review? I mean, I know there's a position paper that's been placed, but I'm just questioning it in my head in terms of a manner to respond.
So the draft was submitted to Haukura staff around 3 weeks ago, and we received the response on the 24th.
Okay.
The changes, we would like to include all of them, but we had already submitted our final draft to this committee. So our intention, and it comes through in the resolutions, is that we would like we recommend the committee delegates to the chair, deputy chair, and a Haukura member for the final sign-off of the submission, so that we can make sure those get included.
Okay, thank you for that response. In terms of in terms of that means then, to give it effect, there is the possibility that the considerations from chair to chair could be included, yes? Is that what I'm hearing?
Sorry, can you just repeat what would be included?
In terms of actually getting the finer detail into the draft, you're saying to me that through chair to chair, there could be the probability of it being included, yeah?
That is our recommendation. For the benefit of the room, the 3 changes that were highlighted in the Haukura markup were that the Haukura position paper from July 24 be a primary attachment as opposed to in the insights report. The second is a recommendation on including some quantitative evidence in the report. I think that makes sense, and some grammatical and naming conventions. So I think we'll be making those recommendations to the delegated members.
Okay, thank you.
Wayne?
Sure. So I've got a question around supplementary information that might go with our submission. And the particular concern I've got goes to the matter of revenue allocation, because that is critical if we are to have the revenue to deal with the public transport and other alternatives that are fundamental. And secondly, the matter of trialling. My personal view, and the reason why I think it's important for us to have supplementary information around our concerns, is that I'm rather cynical about congestion charging because of Auckland's geography, and the fact that across many parts of Auckland now we've got congestion at peak and also off peak. So shifting the time just shifts the problem, doesn't solve the solution. And our public transport and other options in many cases poor, to say the least, and even with the CRL, I don't know that we're going to solve them. So is it possible to actually convey to the government the seriousness of those concerns and other concerns? Otherwise, we end up with something that is not fit for purpose, if it's fit for purpose at all, particularly against a background where there may well be more economical options like the intelligent intersections and like that at far less cost dramatically enhance flows and are what other cities are doing in the majority rather than the limited number that apply congestion charging.
I mean, I think we are collectively conveying, and the submission does touch on this to government, the importance of this issue. I mean, we've recently released the the Mayor's office recently released the work showing that the cost of congestion that Mark covered earlier on. So we're reflecting that that number is now getting to be a very, very large number. We're highlighting that congestion is an issue now, will continue to grow and it will get worse. We recognise the point that, you know, time of use charging may not necessarily be a silver bullet everywhere, but where these schemes have been implemented, they have been extremely effective in reducing congestion. And there's definitely parts of Auckland where this can succeed. So I think our recommendation is that this is a tool that we definitely want in the toolbox. You know, there are places in Auckland that are well served. We're about to invest in CRL and a whole range of improvements to our public transport network. So, you know, there's definitely scope in the work that we've done in terms of modelling. You know, there's been lots and lots of work, and it does give us confidence that this kind of scheme can work. It's a useful thing. We should seek the legislation.
I think I'll just add, through 2024, we undertook a lot of work across 7 different areas. So there's the core 2 parts of a scheme, that is the charge area and the tariff. But then there's 5 others, the technology, the governance, mitigations, complementary measures, and I'm going to forget the last one. But importantly, we covered those so that we could answer the legislation, whatever was in there. So we have brought to you today information that answers that legislation and shows what we believe would be a good framework for Auckland. And we plan to bring the remaining information to you to workshop so we can understand that wider information. But for the purpose of the legislation, we believe this is the comprehensive data.
So just back to my question around supplementary information, especially as it goes to the importance of trialling. Are you going to be supplying information around that?
Sorry, which sort of, I mean, we do say in the submission that we think trialling, we want changes to the legislation to enable trialling. I mean, the trialling is quite a tricky thing in terms of the governance framework that they've set up in the legislation. We're trying to work as much as possible within that framework, but we're certainly saying that the legislation should enable opportunities for that trialling to occur. So, you know, if it turns out in a future scheme that we want to test a scheme with the public or in certain areas via trialling, we'd like that option.
And the message we heard from the political reference group is the purpose of the trial is for speed of implementation and flexibility to test things. They're the real drivers. So we are trying to get that across in our submission as well.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Wayne Brown.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, I was partially answered about trialling. You know, I do want to push for trialling, but the trialling could be something also on price. I think in New York it didn't work until they changed the price, got the price right, and then it worked. But I generally support what the submission to have more local say, but I would like to ask you to broaden the trialling to include price trialling as well. No one is going to get it dead right to know what is the number that would work best right from the start. The other thing I would like to somehow or other reflect is that the government seems to have an obsession from Wellington to have national consistency. But this is not something that you'll be able to get national consistency to work on, because it's never going to be needed in most places. And then even in Auckland, there'll be different places with different responses. So can the submission, which I generally support, be slightly altered to cover those two things?
The draft legislation does include the need for reviewing of the scheme and adjusting from time to time, and that, in my view, is more important even than the trialling aspect, because essentially that is acknowledging the issue that we're not going to get the price right immediately, and over time people do make adjustments as the system changes, so we will be regularly able to review the price setting. And so our submission supports that requirement for review.
Good, very good.
That's it.
And the national consistency is a thing that I'm worried about, because it's not possible to have national consistency. Most of the places will never have it.
Yeah, we agree, and we did make a point along those lines within the submission.
All right. Well,
But
I'm
we'll
reasonably happy with the submission.
Yep.
And but I'm not as keen on any exemptions as some councillors seem to be. The exemption is you just change the time you use the road.
Okay, thank you. You can happy driving. Okay, no further questions. Thank you, gents. And just want to acknowledge the amount of work that has gone into this, and it's been pretty tough because we didn't know what was coming, and you were working in a vacuum of sort of knowledge and understanding. So I do want to acknowledge just how much effort you have put into this collectively to try and sort of sweep all those ball bearings into what sort of looks like a pile. So thank you, and good work. So comments, John?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of quick comments. I found parts of the submission a little more ebullient or upbeat than I would maybe have been. The executive summary: Auckland Council welcomes the bill and supports its overall intent. And Mark did go through the kind of previous resolutions that are meant to be guiding us here, and it's not quite so. It's a little bit more guarded, a little bit more circumspect. So we support in principle, okay, we support in principle congestion pricing. You know, that's there's a general idea without much in the way of details. And then the key word that was used in that 21 resolution, conditional upon the following issues being addressed. So support is only conditional on, one, mitigation of equity impacts, and that could take a number of forms, I would suggest, not just the obvious one to do with poorer people. There are other equity issues. And two, having public transport services and projects in place, so not in line, in place across Auckland on an equitable basis to allow road users to switch
another
alternative
bill
roads where appropriate.
over.
So that was quite a strong guidance on a number of issues there. Public transport services, projects all in place, equitable basis, and allowing people to switch at the time. And I think we're quite a long way off that. Good on the team for pointing out some of the flaws, which are a little concerning in this legislation, in terms of, you know, the lack of control or governance that would enable us to be rather impotent when it comes to challenging adverse effects, financial costs, any scheme that might be opposed by the community. You would have thought that would have been something that would have been addressed up front to try and engender a bit of confidence, but they haven't done that, which is a little concerning in itself. And then, pretty limited view of mitigation. So I guess, Mr. Chair, it's easy enough just to support these at each turn, and this one advances a little bit more. As it advances, I'm having more concerns, not the other way around, and I think a couple of other councillors have signalled that too. When you ask the obvious one about pricing, that's a detail to be sorted out later on. I see the figure of $5 like bandied around quite as almost a de facto kind of sum that'll be landed on. I've heard various people saying that, including the guy that was in the car a little while ago. $5, away, that's $2,500 a year. One person, two people in a family, it's $5,000. So, yeah, I'm more uncertain. I don't want to be a negative Nelly, but I'm more uncertain about this now than ever, and everything I see happening, and especially in terms of what appeared in this, in this legislation that we're submitting on, is showing it's going to be quite a bit away from that quite clear resolution that's passed back in 2021, which was imposing a number of reasonable expectations. I don't think they're going to go anywhere near a number of those, to be honest. And the last thing I'm going to do now is support yet another charge. We've had the interim transport levy with your predecessor, Councillor Baker, the Right Honourable Member from Franklin. We had $340 of that. We had the regional fuel tax and all the hoop-ha about that wasn't exactly transformational. I don't hear too many people in my ward complaining about having gone. And now here's the next big thing is congestion charging, which to me has a very unwelcome feeling of just being another revenue-raising gig that will be rolled out across Auckland. So some good points in this submission. I'm not nearly as upbeat as some of the other parts of it would seem to suggest. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been consistent about my opposition to this scheme. It once was conventional wisdom that you would implement these sorts of schemes, a la London, Singapore, once you had a mature, functioning, well-patronised, efficient public transport system. We don't have that, still don't have it, despite billions that ratepayers have spent and taxpayers have spent over the last 20 years or so. In fact, we're going back, and probably because of that, those who support these sorts of schemes can't wait as an efficient, functioning, international standard public transport system slips further and further into the distance. So the cart has been put before the horse. We're going to have this congestion charging scheme before we attain the nirvana of a decent public transport system. There's a lot of talk about revenue, how it's going to be shared around. The main part of the revenue, the bulk of the revenue, will go to the private corporate, which will be running the scheme, the IT, the cameras, the invoices, and so on. And what will happen is that, on the other hand, the average Auckland working family is going to cop another bill to worry about, to have to pay. And in effect, then we'll be having implementing a regressive tax scheme, taxation scheme on Aucklanders. So the people advocating the scheme, there's a certain irony people in the system advocating the scheme probably won't be paying for it at all. It'll be in the expense account, it'll be in the out-of-pocket expenses and so on. It's the average working Aucklander which will be paying for the scheme. And I don't think that's particularly equitable. The people in Auckland are being squeezed already. This year, over $3 billion of rates will be charged on Auckland residents and ratepayers. That is the fact of the matter. And again, this is inequitable, unfair. It won't particularly work that well at all. We still won't have a decent public transport system. And all it will mean is that the people whom we in the local government system, the interests of the people that we are meant to represent, will be sold out. They'll be having to pay more. In effect, they'll be getting less service for what they're paying. So I have to say, I firmly oppose the idea. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mike. Shane.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be brief. I've taken a lot of time today, but look, pointing out here, look, Councillor Watson makes a lot of great points, and I just want to thank him for raising, particularly one of the points around, we're talking about conditions of support here. I think that's important not to lose, because there's a lot of stuff that we've talked about in this debate that we need to actually get across the line to make this scheme actually work, if indeed we were wanting it to work. Yeah, the uncomfortable thing, because I've long been sceptical in these debates, and the pragmatic element here is the government can just impose this on us. You know, we can't forget that. So we have a bit of a delicate dance where the rational option, I think, is to stay at the table and raise the issues that we have raised in all of these resolutions. And, you know, I've got a couple more that I would raise too, and just in line with Councillor Lee's views, which I thought were good. Urban planning over generations has pushed out poorer Aucklanders. You know, lower socioeconomic communities having to living further and further away from the centre of town. And the jobs have not gone with them. They're the ones that are getting up at 6 a.m. and coming home after the kids are asleep, just to put food on the table. They're the ones that are working hard in different parts of the city, and in many cases will be captured by the proposed charge. And so I would say they're victims of poor urban planning decisions over generations, not bringing the jobs to them. And so this is a context element here of this debate. The other thing I would add is that there hasn't really been much of a check on public opinion here. I'm finding these reports harder and harder to vote through. And I do so because we need to stay at the table. But look, I want to know what my residents actually think about this. I suspect I know what they think, but I want to know, right? At what point do we ask the public what they think about this? Because we don't have really any visibility on that. So those are kind of a couple of extra points. And I've talked previously about how implementing the scheme in other world cities have much better public transport than we do. Stockholm's always used an example. It's got double the amount of train stations Auckland does, for example. So we've got a huge amount of issues, but it is rational for us to continue to raise these issues with the government and try and engage in as much good faith as possible. So look, I'll be supporting this, and I thank staff for their hard work on this submission. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Shane. Morris isn't here, so Richard.
Thank you. No, it's similar to what everyone who's spoken on this. I think that we do need the ability to have this tool and work with the government to look at it. I do have major concerns, as echoed in previous agenda items on this committee today, that we are saying one thing, but the funding from government and the GPS is doing another. We have said before that congestion charging would be great if everyone had options, and the current GPS doesn't give everyone options, and I've given that feedback to ministers as well, that if we are not being able to fund critical rapid transit from city centre to Mangere through all those suburbs, the Northwest Rapid Transit, which has been on the books for a bazillion years, potentially one day rapid transit across the harbour, those need to be progressing to give people hope there is other options, to make space on the road for those who need to drive or have no other options. So although we need to keep and partner with the government going forward on this, because as Councillor Henderson said, it could be rolled out without our permission. It would be silly to do that. But we do need to create any scheme in the future that can show the benefits. If it is $5 each day, you know, we would have to prove or show the community that they're saving more than that in time and petrol, etc. If you are spending 2 hours each way in traffic each day, and this suddenly made this 45 minutes, I think $5 would be a good spend. But we need to prove that, we need to model that, we need to show that. And unfortunately, we don't get to all that work, and we don't get to work on schemes if we don't have this legislation. So it's a bit of chicken and egg. It is a bit of trust. Our city is very congested, and it's the main thing that people complain to us. And governments come and go, and they all have different ideas for us, but this does give us a tool to work on. And it also gives us a tool to say, absolutely, you know, when the legislation passes, we won't be implementing anything until we have X, Y, Z open or more funding in this area, or proof that it's going to be better for the majority. But the issue is continually doing nothing is a big mistake too. So I will support the direction going forward, but it doesn't mean tomorrow this is going to be on our streets with no mitigations, with no conversations, with no additional public transport, etc. So I think it's important to have tools. The government doesn't seem that interested in giving us many tools and also taking some away. So I think in some ways we've worked with them and the previous government on this direction for a very long time. But any scheme that came into Auckland would be a significant amount of consultation and a significant amount of other work before we ever rolled something out. That would be my assumption anyway. But thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Maurice.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm very much in favour of time of use charging in principle, and I agree with a number of people around the table. The devil is in the detail and what you set it at and so on. But if you ask yourself some sort of fundamental questions, and that is, do all the trips that are occurring on our roading network have to all occur at the exact time they do? The answer has to be no. There are trucks blocking the highway at absolute peak commuter times that could go an hour later and do it and probably arrive at the depot around about the same time. And so to have some sort of pricing signal to those users that do not need to go at that time, or could go an alternative route and not create the congestion, I think is a good thing to do. I've seen really good examples that I spent some time up in the Birmingham area and the Midlands going on from Birmingham up to Manchester. The private sector built a thing called the M6 toll road, and it sits right beside the M6. Now the M6 is free, you can go on it any time you like, but try doing anything more than about 5 miles per hour, because it's just absolutely blocked and stopped. But for £3, I think it was, for a car and £8 for a truck, you could go through that same roading network up to Manchester in about an hour and a half less time. Now, I don't know what you think, but for most people, I think their time's worth more than £3 for an hour and a half. And certainly for a big truck running with diesel and so on, it's worth it. So there are some real gains because people will change behaviour. They may go later, they may go earlier, they may not even need to make that particular journey, but because the current use of that road is free, they just do it. Anything that's free just gets overused. That's just a simple law of economics. So I think the principle of it, given that I hear so many people around this table saying, I never stop hearing it, we're never going to be able to build more roads, we're never going to build our way out of it. I actually don't agree with that, but even if we say there won't be any more roading, we've got to provide some sort of a throttle on the supply end of it, if we can. Now, you could design it to be a big revenue maker. I don't think we should. I think we should try to make it so that it's not a big revenue generator for us. But I think that if some people in the morning or afternoon or whatever decide, do I have to go right now? Do I have to go? And if that decision is tempered by, well, it's actually going to be $3 cheaper or $5 cheaper or whatever it is in an hour's time, then I think that's a fantastic outcome. If you go back to my M6 and M6 toll road, they were only being throttled or not by just the price. But here, we're able to give you the out of that price at different time. So it's actually even more, it's more sort of user-friendly to people to say, I don't need to go and see Auntie Myrtle at 9 o'clock today, I'll go at 11 when the traffic's eased up. And certainly in the big trucking things, those motorways in the morning coming in are absolutely locked, blocked and stopped by massive big rigs that could easily have to temper whether they use those roads for another hour, and as I said, in many cases probably still get to their destination around the same time, given being so slowed up by it. So this is a good concept in principle. I accept that there is a lot of detail to done, and the devil is the detail, but we would be fools not to explore getting something like this that gets us some of the congestion that's out there that is as gnarly as you'll ever get anywhere. I lived in Los Angeles, and I can tell you that some of the congestion here is worse than I had to put up in LA. And that's how bad it's got in the mornings and afternoons around this place. So I'm very much in favour of this.
Thank you. And Mayor Brown, hopefully you're out of the congestion, you've stopped driving and you have pulled over to the side of the road. But your gig.
Okay, I just want to say that follow Councillor Williamson, and I support this as well. And just remind you that we've already got it going. Ports of Auckland are charging more for a truck to be collecting a container during the day than at night. We've got empty roads at night, and the truckies are discovering they can do 4 trips for container out to Southdown at night and only 2 in the daytime. They're working it out. So I support it. Thanks very much. That's it.
Thank you. Okay. No further commentary. I'll put this. All those in favour say aye. Aye. And against?
Aye.
No. No.
No.
Do you want to record it against?
Yes, please.
Please record my vote against.
We will do that, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, carried. Thank you very much.